In the clinical documents reviewed by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross in the late 1990s, one case stood out due to the unusual degree of consistency between a near-death experience, NDE, and a set of memories that didn't belong to the patient's known biography. The American boy, officially registered only by the initials TA, was 8 years old when he suffered cardiorespiratory arrest following a sudden event of anaphylaxis during a family picnic in Flagstaff, Arizona. He was resuscitated within the time considered borderline for avoiding prolonged hypoxia, but what followed after the return of consciousness went beyond the typical clinical pattern of post-ischemic confusion. Kübler-Ross described in her notes that the boy recovered spatial orientation faster than expected and that his first sentence did not relate to the medical event. According to her, TA opened his eyes and, in a neutral tone, verbalized something the team couldn't immediately interpret. He said, "I couldn't go back." The phrase was initially treated as the echo of an intrusive dream, but the lexical pattern caught the attention of the attending pediatrician, who reported an absence of syntactic disorganization, something rare in patients newly recovered from an anaphylactic shock with documented hypoxia. In the following hours, while under monitoring, the boy began to describe with remarkable precision a sequence of events that, he claimed, had occurred before waking up here. He reported being in a place without walls, full of diffuse light, where a man, described with details incompatible with his child's vocabulary, had placed his hand on his shoulder and stated, "You cannot go back." For Kübler-Ross, who studied the psychological and narrative patterns of post-NDE patients, the content was atypical due to the absence of fantastical elements. She noted that the speech had objective narrative structure with no signs of imaginative elaboration. The point that shifted the case from the strictly medical to the investigative field appeared the next morning. While talking to the day shift nurse, TA mentioned facts that didn't belong to his current life, describing a routine that involved working in a mechanic's workshop, frequent crossings on a rural road, and the sudden feeling of a side impact before everything went black. The nurse recorded that the boy used technical terms that weren't part of his family environment, such as drive shaft and locked clutch, surprising even his father, who worked in administration and had never been involved with automotive mechanics. Kübler-Ross, upon reviewing the case, highlighted the persistence of the content. The reports did not emerge as episodic delirium, but with structural stability over days, without the cognitive fluctuations expected in post-traumatic conditions. She noted that the child showed specific anxiety when hearing cars accelerating on the hospital street and presented an increased autonomic response, tachycardia and palmar sweating, when questioned about road intersections. Based on this set of symptoms, Kübler-Ross classified the case as not explainable exclusively by known neurophysiological mechanisms. This record, discreet but firm, would be the starting point for one of the most meticulous analyses she conducted in her later career, integrating NDE, memory, and identity. In the weeks following the anaphylaxis episode, TA began to show a behavioral pattern that drew even more attention from the monitoring team. The hospital psychologist, assigned for post-event assessment, recorded that the boy presented a type of spontaneous recall that differed substantially from reconstructed memories. There was no typical hesitation, nor gaps filled by childlike inference. The descriptions came out complete, with linear temporal transitions and stable sensory elements, as if they were excerpts from a consolidated memory. During one of the clinical sessions, TA stated matter-of-factly that he knew what it was like to die crushed, a phrase that immediately caused discomfort in the room, but which he completed naturally. "It was fast. I just felt the noise." When asked about the origin of this perception, his answer was consistent with the previous narrative pattern. He described a narrow stretch of road surrounded by cornfields where a larger truck hit the side. The child had never traveled to the rural Midwest and had no visual reference that would justify such precision. The account deepened when the boy detailed that the impact would have occurred on a cold autumn day, mentioning the presence of dry leaves stuck to the windshield, an apparently trivial piece of information, but one that Kübler-Ross noted with special interest for its phenomenological character. In her opinion, she highlighted that children in this age range rarely construct multiple sensory reports without internal variations. The fact that TA maintained consistency between color, texture, location, and thermal sensation over different days suggested an unusual pattern of mnemonic recovery. Another point that intrigued the professionals was the emergence of an unexpected skill. The boy began to demonstrate operational knowledge of automotive parts that should not have been part of an 8-year-old suburban child's repertoire. In one of the sessions, he picked up a construction toy and rearranged the pieces to form a complete axle, pointing out where there was always a problem when the pedal trembled. His father, observing the scene, stated he had no familiarity with the subject and guaranteed that his son had never had contact with workshops or mechanical relatives. The nursing staff also reported nighttime episodes in which TA woke up abruptly, clutching his chest, as if reproducing a conditioned reflex of a traumatic event. There was no physiological relation to his current clinical condition, and cardiological exams showed no abnormalities. However, Kübler-Ross emphasized in her opinions that conditioned autonomic responses can occur when there is storage of memories of events that do not belong to the present biographical cycle, an observation she treated with extreme caution, but considered relevant when accompanied by descriptive consistency. An additional detail added even more complexity to the case. During a casual conversation, TA mentioned an incomplete male name, something like Cal or Callum, according to the record, and stated that that's what they called me there. Asked about the meaning of there, he answered with disconcerting simplicity, "Before coming back here, before the man said I couldn't go back." The insistence on this figure, the man who said I couldn't go back, remained stable throughout all the reports. TA never described him as familiar, religious, or threatening. He called him only the man, mentioning that he looked tired, and repeated the phrase like someone fulfilling a rule, not issuing an emotional warning. This point was underscored by Kübler-Ross. The absence of a strong symbolic load was incompatible with a structured hallucination, but coherent with NDE narratives that privileged a sense of transition, not fantasy. This set of factors, linear memories, technical terms, congruent physiological responses, and a recurrent figure without archetypal connotation, led Kübler-Ross to deepen the investigation, maintaining discretion and rigid clinical criteria. For her, this was not just a post-traumatic report, it was a case that demanded systematic documentary analysis. At the request of the medical team, and with formal parental authorization, Kübler-Ross began a longitudinal analysis of the case, structuring periodic interviews and controlled behavioral observation. Despite avoiding conclusive interpretations, she emphasized the need to record every detail with clinical rigor, especially because the memory pattern presented by TA did not dissipate over time. On the contrary, it became more specific. One of the first steps was to verify whether the child's descriptions could have been acquired through indirect exposure, television, adult conversations, magazines, external environments. None of this was confirmed. The family history showed a typical middle-class routine in Arizona, with little geographical mobility and no relatives involved with road transport, mechanics, agriculture, or rural work. The father worked in accounting. The mother was a substitute teacher. The absence of stimuli related to the boy's descriptions reinforced what Kübler-Ross called environmental incongruity. During a meeting held 3 weeks after hospital discharge, TA exhibited unexpected behavior. When invited to draw freely, a common technique to access nonverbal content in pediatric consultations, he sketched a rural intersection with precise lines and a track incline compatible with American Midwest secondary roads. He also added a medium-sized truck, represented in a way that surprised the assistant psychologist. There was correct proportion between the cab, body, and axles, something rare for a child. When asked where he got that image, he calmly replied, "That's where I worked before. It's weird to be in another body." The phrase was fully noted. For Kübler-Ross, the critical point was not the content itself, but the descriptive tone, free of exaggerated emotion, without dramatic load, with vocabulary compatible with his age, yet structured as a factual reference. This pattern, she noted, differed from elaborate imagination, where children's narratives tend toward hyperbole and discontinuity. The following week, another episode deepened the clinical doubts. During a walk with his father to the hospital parking lot, part of an emotional readaptation protocol, T.A. froze upon hearing the deep sound of braking at a distance. There was no real danger, but the autonomic response was immediate. Tachycardia, fine hand tremors, and paleness. When questioned later, he reported that it sounded like the day everything ended. This type of phobic response is common in post-traumatic stress disorders, but the absence of real physical trauma in his current life placed the phenomenon in an atypical category. Kübler-Ross, compiling her notes, highlighted something especially intriguing. The child did not seem confused about which life he was living. He didn't mix identities. He didn't claim to be another person in the present. He recounted the previous experience like someone observing an old file, saying on one occasion, "It's like remembering a movie I've already seen, only I was the one living it." This distinction, clear and stable, reinforced that it was not delirium, as there was no rupture of the current identity. It was in this context that Kübler-Ross decided to look for possible historical correspondences, not to prove reincarnation, but to rule out coincidences or indirect memory contamination. The methodology was simple. Check fatal road accidents around the approximate period cited by the boy in regions that corresponded to the geographical descriptions. Her intention was purely technical. She was looking for inconsistencies, not confirmations. However, when cross-referencing dates and circumstances, she found a record that made her discreetly note the word compatible next to a 1976 police occurrence in rural Iowa. A man with the initials CAL. A rural mechanic, killed after a side impact involving a medium-sized truck on a secondary road surrounded by cornfields. The accident description included a curious excerpt. The windshield still showed marks of dry leaves, adhered by the dampness of the early morning. It was the first point of objective convergence. From the moment Kübler-Ross found the Iowa accident record, her procedure became more cautious. She did not wish, under any circumstances, to induce the child to any narrative. Therefore, she maintained absolute secrecy about the discovery, even with the auxiliary team. The goal was not to validate extraordinary hypotheses, but to observe whether the content presented by TA would remain coherent without any external stimulus. In the subsequent interviews, conducted in a neutral environment and with standardized protocols, the boy began to add temporal details previously absent. He repeatedly referred to the smell of gasoline at the end of the day, describing the odor as something routine and associated with working in the workshop. The responsible psychologist observed that children of his age tend to describe smells generically, whereas TA made phenomenological distinctions. He mentioned old gasoline, hot grease, and burnt rubber as familiar elements. These terms coincided with the vocabulary of automotive professionals in the 1970s, but were completely absent from the child's current routine. Another important point emerged during a clinical exercise aimed at assessing semantic memory and guided imagination. When asked to imagine a place where he felt productive, TA described without hesitation a small workshop with a cracked concrete floor, where he worked fixing things for neighbors. The detail that caught attention was the mention of an old radio that only got country music, and the habit of turning it off before closing the garage so that it wouldn't drain the battery. This reference made sense in the historical context of the 1970s. Many automotive radios jury-rigged in rural workshops were connected directly to an external battery, but was anachronistic in the child's life, who had grown up in an urban environment with modern electronics. Kübler-Ross carefully analyzed the reports, comparing them with the information from the fatal case she had found. Although she never showed the record to the team or the parents, she noted discrete parallels. The side impact accident, the time of year corresponding to autumn, the mechanical work, the road surrounded by cornfields, and now small elements of daily life that coincided with the profile of CAL, the documented victim in Iowa. There were no direct connections, but the internal consistency of TA's memories made it unlikely that everything was a product of spontaneous creation. In a session marked by special clinical attention, the boy made an observation that Kübler-Ross classified as an analytical rupture. While manipulating pieces of a mechanical toy provided by the therapist, TA said simply, "It's weird to have small hands. I remember bigger hands with cuts here," pointing to the area between the thumb and forefinger. He described linear scars and superficial burns, common in professionals who work with hot engines. No such scars existed on his own body, most notably in CAL. His medical file, there was a mention of old scars on his hands, resulting from repeated minor injuries from handling heated parts. Information contained only in a low circulation forensic report, impossible for an 8-year-old child to access. Kübler-Ross recorded the episode with methodological coolness, but made a rare comment in her notes. The coupling between sensory content and physical detail suggests a non-imaginative origin. Nothing more than that. No conclusions. No metaphysical interpretations. The next episode, however, took the case to another level of complexity. On an afternoon of observation, while drawing without a thematic prompt, TA spontaneously wrote 3 letters in the corner of the sheet, CAL. When asked about the meaning, he replied with disconcerting naturalness, "That's how they signed my tools." It was the first time he had verbalized something directly compatible with the initials of the man killed in the Iowa accident, without ever having had access to that information. After the initials episode, Kübler-Ross intensified the longitudinal observation, but maintained absolute neutrality in clinical management. Her primary fear was the possibility of suggestive contamination. Any exaggerated reaction, even if involuntary, could influence TA's narrative content. Therefore, in the subsequent sessions, the investigation focused exclusively on open-ended questions, assessing spontaneity, consistency, and absence of induction. The child continued to present an exceptional pattern of recall. In one session, he reported that he worked better in the morning when the light was colder, an unusual phrase for an 8-year-old boy. The assistant psychologist asked him to explain what he meant by cold light. He replied, "When the sun is low and hasn't heated the metal yet, we could take everything apart without burning our fingers." It was a precise description of the thermal behavior of engines and metal surfaces at dawn, technical knowledge that was not part of his current life experience. Kübler-Ross then began to analyze the temporal linearity of the reports. Children usually reorganize events chaotically, but TA maintained a stable internal sequence. He always described the routine before the accident in the same order: open the garage, check an old pickup truck he called my road companion, have a late lunch, adjust parts for neighbors, and close the workshop at dusk. None of this information existed in the boy's real biography, yet it appeared with precision. In one of the final sessions of the observation cycle, a decisive episode occurred. The psychologist asked him to draw any tool he remembered. Without much thought, TA sketched an old wrench with a worn side thread. Showing the drawing, he commented, "Mine had the handle broken here," pointing to an irregular curve. Kübler-Ross later confirmed in the 1976 forensic report that one of CAL's personal belongings recovered from the workshop was indeed a wrench with a damaged handle, a description that disconcertingly coincided with the boy's drawing. The most impressive point, however, occurred when T.A., as father, unaware of the investigated details, brought an old toy toolkit to the office, trying to encourage his son to play more lightly. Upon seeing a small metal key, T.A. stood still for a few seconds and said, almost as a reflex, "Mine fell on the floor that day, the day I didn't come back." The silence that followed was recorded by the therapist as emotional response associated with intrusive memory not belonging to the current life. Kübler-Ross analyzed the phenomenon with academic coolness. There were no signs of psychotic confusion, severe dissociation, or external influence. The child remained oriented, played normally outside the moments of recall, and did not demonstrate a desire to sustain the narrative. On the contrary, he frequently said he wanted to forget that because it belonged somewhere else. This clear differentiation between current identity and previous contents was, for Kübler-Ross, one of the strongest markers of phenomenological authenticity. Not factual authenticity, but authenticity of the cognitive process. The final component that would set the stage for the psychiatrist's conclusion arose during an appointment when an old pickup truck was parked on the street outside the office. T.A. looked out the window and stated, without any dramatics, "Mine was the same, but light blue. I died in there." The team remained silent. There was no way the child could know the specific model involved in the 1976 accident. A medium, single-cab utility vehicle, faded blue. This correspondence, even probabilistic, caught Kübler-Ross's attention, who noted recurrent patterns of thematic and technical coherence, absence of identifiable external sources. She knew she needed to formulate a final opinion without crossing ethical or scientific boundaries. What she wrote there would determine how the case would be remembered. When the time came to formulate the final opinion, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross adopted the same rigor that had accompanied her throughout decades of clinical research. She did not seek to validate beliefs, but to describe human phenomena with precision and sobriety. Thus, she analyzed all the notes accumulated over the months, the spontaneous recalls, the technical details compatible with the life of a rural mechanic in the 1970s, the phenomenological pattern of the memories, the conditioned physiological responses, and the total absence of environmental stimuli capable of producing such content. In her summary, she divided the case into three axes: narrative coherence, technical congruence, and environmental independence. On the first axis, she highlighted that T.A. never presented signs of childlike confabulation. The content emerged with stability, without internal contradictions, without attempts to impress adults. He was not seeking attention. He often avoided talking about the subject. This, for Kübler-Ross, was indicative of intrusive memory. But intrusive of what? The child had not experienced any physical trauma compatible with the reports. On the second axis, she drew attention to the specific mechanical knowledge. Expressions like locked clutch, drive shaft, burnt rubber, in addition to the technical precision in identifying parts, were not common even among lay adults and completely improbable in an 8-year-old boy without formal access to that universe. The correspondence with forensic details, such as the broken wrench and the described scars on the hands, surpassed, she noted, the limit of plausible chance. The third axis, perhaps the most decisive, involved environmental isolation. The boy's family, school, and social environment were incompatible with any direct or indirect exposure to the evoked information. With no contact with mechanics, no trips to the Midwest, no relatives linked to workshops, and no media history that could serve as a source, Kübler-Ross classified the origin of the memories as unidentified. In her report, she avoided any conclusive statement, but recorded a phrase that would become a reference among later researchers. When a child presents memories that do not belong to their biography, but behave like true memories, we must consider the possibility of continuity of consciousness beyond the organic cycle. It was not a metaphysical statement. It was a methodological opening. TA's case remained under follow-up until the reports began to dissipate about a year later. They did not disappear abruptly. They became more spaced out, more fragmented, until they stopped emerging spontaneously. Kübler-Ross interpreted this process as a reorganization of the present identity, a natural mechanism of the mind to prioritize the current life cycle. According to her notes, the child seemed fully integrated into his own biography at the end of the follow-up. But one last episode was recorded. Shortly before the last consultation, leaving the room, TA turned to the psychiatrist and said simply, "That man, the one who said I couldn't go back, was he wrong?" Kübler-Ross noted only 2 words on her clipboard: legitimate question, and ended it there without speculation. For her, and for those who studied the case later, the boy proved nothing, but he left a clinical trail consistent enough to be taken seriously. And it is precisely this seriousness, free from sensationalism, that kept the case preserved among the most enigmatic accounts documented by Kübler-Ross. An episode where an NDE did not end with the return to life, but apparently opened a door to memories that did not belong to the present, memories that insisted on returning, despite all known biographical rules.